Right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to day 2. We will be starting off this morning with REBT, with Robin Thorburn, one of the, I think I'm right in saying, the longest established full-time hypnotherapy practice in the Edinburgh Greenwich area metropolitan area.
No one's challenged me on it yet, so...
Well, then I'm going to assume that that's quite correct. And I believe you've also done some work with Albert Ellis' wife, is that correct?
Yeah, I've met them both.
Excellent.
And I'm still in touch with Debbie. I got an email from her last night wishing you all the best for today.
Well, that's very kind. Send her one back saying we appreciate that.
I will do.
I'll get off the stage now and you can take over. So
Yes,
I give you Robin Thorburn.
Thank you. Thanks for that. I'm going to try and do this without a microphone if that's okay. Can you hear me? Yeah. Whether you understand me, of course, that's a different ballgame. But as long as you can hear me, we can get going. I'm going to be working from notes initially until I get sort of warmed up, and I'll maybe just start to go off at a tangent. This is called REBT, an interpretation of its theory and practice. I thought long and hard about the title of the presentation, finally deciding to use the term interpretation. Why? Well, because in keeping with true rational emotive behaviour therapy philosophy, it's how a person interprets the world around them that is relevant. Certainly the originator of REBT and the person largely accredited with laying down the intellectual foundations of cognitive behaviour therapy, Albert Ellis, would often quote the Roman philosopher Epictetus. People are not disturbed by things, but the view we take of them. In 2007, a few months before his death, I was invited to New York to meet Dr. Albert Ellis. I asked him what the difference was between cognitive behaviour therapy and rational emotive behaviour therapy. He replied in a gruff voice. He was very ill at the time, but he replied in a very gruff voice by saying, REBT is more philosophical. Now, my interpretation of that reply was that we as humans can think about our thinking and then choose to think differently. He would often say we always have a choice. It might be a highly rotten choice, but we do have the choice. I also decided to choose to call my presentation an interpretation of REBT because of my own personal experiences in overcoming anxiety, depression in the early 1990s. I learned one hell of a lot about it through those experiences. And then subsequently, the 18 years clinical work as I've done as a hypno-psychotherapist. It's not just Ellis, though, that I've been influenced by. I've been very positively influenced by other therapeutic approaches. And through some, I've learned how not, in my view, to do psychotherapy. My main influences outside of Ellis have been Dr. Claire Weeks. She was an Australian medical practitioner who was an expert in nervous problems. In many ways, she was quite unique because if my memory serves me well, I think she was the first woman to qualify out of Sydney University with a doctorate in science. And at age 37 became a medical doctor, so she was co-joining her work on the nervous system with mainstream medical practice. She wrote interestingly and spoke worldwide about sensitization. To me, this is an area that is kind of overlooked by a lot of practitioners. She would often say that it may well have been that your anxiety was created by being unloved by your mother, but current sensitization, bewilderment and fear has to be healed now. As a young man in the 1990s, I found this statement fascinating, particularly having tried to address my anxiety through more psychodynamic approaches, very unsuccessfully. Dr. Weeks furnished me with knowledge and understanding and peace of mind, which I think is very crucial, certainly for giving your client early on. She was awarded an MBE, and quite rightly so, and in my view, a very remarkable clinician. I've also, like many of us here today, been influenced by the work of Milton Erickson. I've found combining his hypnotherapeutic approaches with REBT extremely potent. Whenever I think of Milton Erickson, I smile. I was reading one of the many Ericksonian books that I have, and was reading through some of his many thought-provoking statements about hypno-psychotherapy. One quote in particular stood out. It went something like, I'm not quoting this accurately, so don't sue me. It went something like, he said, I never treat people in mind-altering drugs as I don't know if what I'm doing is working. However, one drug I am in favour of is whiskey. You take it 15 minutes before the client arrives. I've never tried it, I've got to tell you, Sean, wherever you are. So don't strike me off, but I'm thinking about it. Co-joining REBT with Ericksonian approaches in clear weeks, to me, gives the clinician credibility with his or her client. Credibility, in my view, that is so important for the therapeutic relationship, and then more effective hypnotherapy to work. Knowledge, understanding, and endless hours of hard work, study, experience, clinical practice, I think pays off, because the client, I think, knows what you're talking about. You might not be able to help them, but at least you know what you're talking about. I'm only joking. Now, back to Ellis. He's a fellow of 12 divisions, or was a fellow, he's dead now, of 12 divisions of the American Psychological Association, author of over 80 books, 800 academic papers, and was voted one of the most influential psychologists of all time. A colossus in the field of psychotherapy, and despite his at times crusty appearance, one of the kindest persons I've ever met. He practiced what he preached. I personally have learned more and certainly enhanced my therapeutic approaches from Albert Ellis and his wife Debbie. Combining with Claire Weeks and Erickson, I'm now going to try and present REBT, an interpretation of its theory and practice. Most types of human psychological problems are a form of demands. Apart from our interpretation of the external world, I, like Albert Ellis, became aware that many of my clients would be presenting a wide variety of presenting situations and problematic emotions and behaviours. But a common theme emerged for me, and that was that many of them were thinking very rigidly, dogmatically, in almost like a black or white, good or bad, all or nothing manner. Ellis stated that most types of human psychological problems are a form of demands. He cited shoulds, oughts, and musts as being central to maintaining his, or their clients, my client's disturbance of anxiety, anger, and depression. To me, he was one of the few therapists who could actually tell a client what was wrong with them. Because in my view, he was one of the very few who actually genuinely knew what was wrong with them. In New York in 2007, I thanked him for giving me and therapists the world over a model that we could understand and show our clients an effective way to get better and stay better. My rule of thumb is that anxiety, anger, depression are debilitating and self-defeating, and are non-self-helping and ineffective in allowing a person to lead a healthy life. Sadness, annoyance, concern, on the other hand, is normal, livable, overcomable human emotions. A great REBT disputing technique is this. If you really wish to have £10 in your pocket, you checked your pocket only to realise you had 9, you'd probably be disappointed. With disappointment, you could move forward to achieve £10 and more. It's overcomable. However, if you demanded that you should ought or must have £10 in your pocket, and then checked your pocket to find you only had 9, you'd probably be devastated, particularly if you're Scottish. So notice how the emotion has changed, but more specifically, the thought has. It's moved from a preference into a demand. One thing as well I've noticed, certainly in my early years as a therapist, is that I was trying too hard to demand that my client get better, and sort of trying very hard to get supreme positivity. And it didn't really help long term. So just to recap in that, sadness, annoyance, concern, in my view, are normal, livable, overcomeable. From healthy negative emotions, we can move towards aspects of peace of mind. Inaccurate definitions. This leads me to the second part of the irrational, non-self-helping belief. For many years, I also heard my clients at the tail end of their belief system were bringing in the word awful, either levelled against self, usually to create anxiety, others, usually to create anger, or the world to create procrastination or avoidance. In short, they were awfulizing inconvenience. I once had a philosophical discussion with one of my clients who kept using the word awful to describe himself and the world around him. I picked up on this and I said, listen, there's 6 billion fallible, mistake-making human beings on planet Earth with billions and billions of brain cells each. I said, bad things are likely to happen. Nothing then is really awful. What I think he was trying to do was to awfulize inconvenience. That is, take a true statement that was a damn nuisance, whatever was happening, but then catastrophize, calamitize, magnify, terribilize, awfulize. I said nothing is awful, only inconvenient. And I have noticed that many highly intelligent people tell themselves that bad things should not, ought not, must not happen when they're happening. Good things, sorry, I've skipped a page, bad things will inevitably happen. Eventually this client started to take on board this rational, self-helping perspective. And he said to me, he says, you know, you're right. Nothing is awful, except one thing. I said, what's that? He said, my mother-in-law, you've not met her. So with the exception of that guy's mother-in-law, nothing's awful, in my view. To take it to an extreme, I have a friend who gets disappointed if good things happen. He says he enjoys his depression. He supports Heart of Midlothian Football Club, by the way, and I can understand that, but anyway. A woman told Albert Ellis that because she had recently fallen out with a friend, she now thought herself to be a bad person. This, of course, is an accurate definition because she was globally rating her whole self. She wasn't just taking a part of her and damning it, she was damning her whole self, thereby creating an extreme emotion. I think he counted her, he asked her, he said, well, what's wrong? And she said, I've recently fallen out with a friend and I think I'm a bad person. He said, are you telling me you've never done any good? She says, oh, I've done a lot of good things. He said, well, that then makes you a person that does bad things and a person that does good things. He said, the only way you can accurately define yourself as good or bad is when you're dead. And if you have accurate recollection to every good or every bad thing that you've ever done, you could then draw subtotals and say, I've done 6,999 good things and 7,000 bad things, so that makes me a bad person. Until that day ever comes, you're going to have to unconditionally accept the fact that you're a fallible, mistake-making human being who's likely to make mistakes anyway. Because when we rate our totality, it's a bit like going into a bookmaker's shop, putting your whole self-worth on the counter and saying, trap 1. So when the race runs, you're inordinately anxious. We are, and probably always will be, fallible, mistake-making as human beings, but in order to ignore that fact, we create fiction and myths. We cannot unconditionally accept our own fallibility. Well, not all of the time anyway. So to use an old Scottish saying, there's bad in the best of us and good in the worst of us. Another contentious Ellis disputing tactic, he would say that no one is totally good and no one's totally bad. He said Adolf Hitler was not all bad because he loved his dog and his mistress Eva Braun loved him. However, Mother Teresa of Calcutta went to Congress to testify against birth control and showed fascistic tendencies by trying to impose her will on everybody else. The ABC form was developed by Albert Ellis, and he told me he'd been influenced by Stoic philosophers. The ABC form is a cornerstone of REBT, CBT. I certainly notice that many of my clients, when they initially come in, will move from the situation, activating event, and then go straight to C. So they'll tell me how they feel. But they kind of bypass B, what they're telling themselves. The ABC form is pretty helpful too because it doubles as an invaluable tool, so you get feedback in between sessions. A client can fill it in so you can see what's been happening. So it's also a good self-monitoring form. One other vital component of REBT is ongoing work and practice. Aha experiences are rarely enough to get a person better. This next subject, memory most vulnerable to change at the time that we most dislike it. To me, this is quite a fascinating subject because I was personally affected by the way memory works. For many years, Claire Weeks would say that recovery lies in the places that we most fear. She said this way back in the 40s, I think it was, and then this statement intrigued me for many years. One day, whilst in conversation with a friend of mine, a GP, I spoke at length about her techniques. And I said to him that she was basically inferring that memory is most vulnerable to change at the time that we most dislike it. Now, a few months after this conversation, he came round to see me and he showed me a very interesting article from the New Scientist magazine, February 03, entitled Not So Total Recall. The article told of two Canadian neuroscientists who conditioned a rat to have a fear of a box. They'd simultaneously showed the rat the box and electrocuted its paws, so that thereafter all they had to do was show the rat the box and it become fearful, a conditioned response. Crucially, they then set out to decondition the rat of its fear. Apparently, they injected an anti-protein agent into it to dissipate the protein that was surrounding the neurotransmitters or the memory. In other words, try and melt the memory. They then re-showed the rat the box, but the rat was still fearful, and they thought this is really odd. But crucially, when they simultaneously showed the rat the box and gave it the anti-protein agent, the rat lost its fear. The conclusion was that memory is most vulnerable to change at the time that we most dislike it. Now, I don't know about you, but many of my clients will tell me that before they've even entered a problematic situation, that they feel anxious. This is because, in my view, they have a disturbing memory from a previous experience loaded with emotion that they have inadvertently created previously with a demand. In the A column of the ABC form, sorry if you can memorise it, this is when memory resurfaces. Now, according to this article, this is when the memory is most vulnerable to change. But when the person experiences this initial flashback of that feeling, tight chest, churning stomach, dry mouth, whatever it may be, the person tends to recoil or fight it, thus inadvertently writing more emotion on emotion. They keep reconditioning the memory. But they demand that the feeling must not be there. But according to Albert Ellis, the emotion was originally created by the internalized sense or belief. So memory brings back the emotion the next time they're in a similar situation, so they then demand that they mustn't demand. It's akin to me shouting at the dog every time the doorbell rings, and then becoming bewildered as to why he barks even louder the next time the doorbell rings. It's very much a vicious circle in my view. After 40 years in medical practice, the one thing that is likely to keep a sufferer stuck is recurring bouts of memory, said Claire Weeks. Memory works through sight, sound, smell, taste. And she said memory brings back feeling. And according to Ellis, the feeling's been created by an internalized should, ought, or must. Then memory brings back the feeling, then they demand that they mustn't demand. It's kind of applying logic where none exists. So therefore, being more philosophical is pretty helpful. Don't argue with the crowd, so to speak. Put the ball in the net. Going back to that Claire Weeks statement that the memory being most vulnerable to change at the time that we most dislike it, she used to ask her patients if they've ever had the experience of walking past a baker's shop as an adult. And this had age regressed them back to a time as a kid when their grandmother used to make scones. They usually said yes. Most people can identify with that. And she said this is good flashback memory. And since good and bad memory work in much the same way, it's how we react now to the memory that's important. She said we can either, oh my goodness it, what if it, or we could say there's grandma's scones. She said thanks to homely similes, there are thousands of people worldwide going into situations they've been avoiding for years, thinking of grandma's scones. I want to, if I can, speak about the case history of the handshaker, but the icon here is kind of misleading because it's not actually shaking hands, it's a trembling hand. And what is interesting about this is that I'd like, if I can, to speak about a client I had many, many, many years ago. He was in his 30s, he was about 30 years of age, and his difficulties had started, he thought, was when he was age 5. He'd been writing on the blackboard and he'd dropped the chalk in front of the classroom and the class had all laughed. He then had subsequently spent many months in therapy going over this experience in a bid to find a eureka moment, but had so far failed to have it. He subsequently consulted with a GP, a psychologist, and a psychiatrist, all of whom had tried hard to stop the hand shaking. He then came to me looking for the magic of hypnotherapy to help him. As we all do, I took a full case history and found out that what had actually triggered this event was one day he lifted a pen to sign a cheque in front of the company accountant. His hand had trembled and he immediately tried to stop it, with no success. He then went home that night and worried furiously as to what if his hand was going to shake the following day. I think Churchill once said, if was the biggest word in the English dictionary, so you put a what in front of it, it's huge. That's me going off at a tangent. But he worried furiously that night as to whether his hand was going to shake the following day, and sure as guns it did. The problem then generalised to the point that wherever he went, his hand would tremble. After further inquiring, it transpired that he'd been having marriage problems and had recently got promotion at work. He was, I suspected, seeking approval from his wife, his boss, yeah, the GP, the psychologist, and the psychiatrist. His irrational core belief was core belief 1 from REBT. I must be approved of, and if not, I'm a failure. This is a very, very common core belief of people, probably in part from seeking approval from parents, but also, in my view, from our biologically complex nervous systems, enhanced by self-rating against environmental factors to keep us safe, the fight or flight response. I presented my thoughts to my client, and he instantly agreed that he had indeed been trying too hard to please, and if not, he considered his whole self an utter failure. I asked him if anyone had given him an explanation from a physiological perspective as to why his hand was shaking. No, he replied. Well, I told him from my understanding that his heart rate was secreting too much adrenaline into the bloodstream due to his demand not to look foolish. Glands above the kidneys were secreting too much adrenaline into the bloodstream. Adrenaline was then being carried via the bloodstream to the very ends of his fingers, little spindles, which were being activated by the adrenaline, sending another danger signal back up to the spinal cord and another danger signal back to the finger ends. And in fact, it was a series of finger jerks. He found this quite interesting in as much. He said, so it's adrenaline that is also the enemy. I said, yes, and your reaction to the adrenaline that perpetuates more. A truly vicious circle. What do I do now? He exclaimed. I said, well, you're not going to like the reply I'm going to give you, but if you do what I suggest, your hand will eventually stop shaking. He said, what's that? I said, I want you to let your hand shake, willingly, on your terms. He jumped to his feet, his eyes went this big, and he said, but I've tried so hard to stop it. I said, so's a psychiatrist, a psychologist, and a GP. It's not worked, has it? We then did some stuff in hypnotherapy, and he came back a week later. And he said, I've had partial success, but it's still shaking. I said, yeah, but a 100-metre sprinter can't stop 1 yard over the finishing line. Because of the sensitised nature of the nervous system, the sprinter, so to speak, has to keep running to expend those forces. Within about 3 weeks, the hand had stopped shaking. What I want to do now, if I can, if you're still understanding me, and I've not had any shoes thrown at me yet, so I'll keep going, is try and do some rational emotive imagery, REI. I'm going to ask for a participant, if one's available, and it's really a basic technique redeveloped by Albert Ellis. I think it was a guy, Maxie Maltzby, originally developed it, but Ellis felt it wasn't evocative enough. To me, this kind of encapsulates what my findings are so far. I'm going to ask for a participant to come up here. Obviously, I don't have the time for a full case history, etc., etc. But if we can have someone who's maybe got a low to moderate anxiety, although it could be for any problem, if we could maybe have a low to moderate anxiety-related problem, maybe such as going into, I don't know, a crowded room or something like that, and if we could use the subjective unit of discomfort scale and keep it about a 4 out of 10, I don't want to go up about a 9. So if we got someone who could maybe present a 4 out of 10 problem, what I'm then going to ask them to do is to recall the situation. That's the activating event. Grandma scones or memory will then bring back the emotion. Now for 1 minute, I'm going to ask you to just observe the emotion. Don't try and change it. That's cognitive distraction. Don't try and analyse it. Stay with the feeling for 1 minute. And after a minute, it will gradually dissipate itself. then silently I'm going to ask you to, in your own self-talk, say, I don't like it, but I can unconditionally accept me, because people usually damn themselves when that problem occurs. And if we do this correctly, we're going to move, say, a 4 or a 5 out of 10 down to about a 2. And when this technique is actually also built into hypnotherapy, it makes it even more powerful. I even at times use the swish technique from NLP with this, but that's for maybe another day. So is there anybody that would like to come up and try this? No?
You're going to have to drag somebody up.
Great. Have we got seats just here, yeah? Hi there.
I'm not a stool, sorry, a stooge.
You're not a Freudian or a Jungian either, are you? Have a seat. What's your name?
Alan.
Alan. Right, Alan, all I'm going to ask you to do, are you able to speak about the presenting situation?
Yes.
Just what situation will it be that you're having a problem in?
Going into the library.
Okay. 0 to 10, 10 being the worst. What feelings of discomfort, what number would you give them?
About 4.
And where
I'm aware of it, but it's not stopping me doing it.
Good. So what I would obviously do at a later stage is maybe work on other stuff, work up the scale, so to speak. What physiological feelings are you getting? Is it a stomach problem, chest? What are you getting?
Yeah, if I really focused on it, maybe a little bit kind of butterflies.
Yeah, and that reminds me, there was an old Scottish comedian, and he went to the doctor. He says, "Doctor," he says, I've got butterflies in my stomach." And the doctor said, "What have you been eating?" He said, "Butterflies." If that's a judicial use of humour, we've got a reframe from Milton Erickson as well.
Cognitive distraction.
Right, so what I'll do is I'll ask you if you can just to become aware of it, replay the situation, and as best as you can, become aware of the sensations, and for 1 minute, kind of rise above it, yeah? Go under the wave, so to speak. Don't stand up against it, that tends to knock you over. So for 1 minute, just let it dissipate. I'll talk you through this, and then silently in your own self-talk, acknowledge that you don't like it, that's reasonable, which is nice, that's reasonable, don't like it, but I was going to use an expletive there, but I'm going to steer through that, but I can accept me, okay? So this one, if we can do this as a quick demonstration, it might be useful, okay? Would you like to close your eyes? Great, and all I'd like you to do, Alan, is just begin to replay that situation that you've just been telling me about. The situation where you're maybe making your way to the library, and just as best as you can, become aware of any sensations appearing in your body that you dislike. It may be a tight chest, churning stomach, maybe the butterflies, whatever. Just as best as you can, for 1 minute, become aware of those sensations. And as best as you can, kind of observe those sensations. Don't try and change them. Don't try and think of something different. Just kind of observe those sensations, almost as if you were looking down on them dispassionately. For 1 minute, rise above them and kind of look down. And gradually, even if it is only just a little bit, those feelings will ever so slightly gradually dissipate. Then, silently in your own self-talk, acknowledge that you don't like that situation or the feelings, because you don't. but you can still unconditionally accept you, if for no other reason you're a human being. So that you may then spontaneously begin to see a better outcome emerging, such as you may be going into the library feeling a little bit more relaxed. Okay, now let's replay that exact same situation again. Just imagine yourself, Alan, heading and arriving at the library. And as you do so, become aware of any sensations appearing in your body that you dislike. Tight chest, churning stomach, dry mouth, whatever. For 1 minute, kind of observe those feelings dispassionately. Don't try and change them, you've tried all that. Don't try and fight them, just observe. And as you do so, those feelings will gradually, ever so slightly, begin to reduce. And then silently in your own self-talk, acknowledge that you don't like the sensations or the situation, but you can unconditionally accept you for no other reason. So that again you may spontaneously see a better outcome emerging, such as you entering into the library feeling a little more relaxed. Now, if we could replay the same situation one more time, and again just imagine yourself walking into the library, and again just becoming aware of any sensations that you dislike. Don't try and change them, just let them be there. It's grandma's scones. And as you do so, just observe them for 1 minute, dispassionately. And as you do so, those feelings will gradually reduce, minimize, maybe even a stalactite of ice melting in the heat. Then, silently in your own self-talk, acknowledge that you don't like the situation and the feelings as you don't, but you can accept you, so that you may spontaneously see a better outcome emerging, such as you feeling a little more relaxed going into the library. Okay, but just when you're ready, feel free just to open your eyes, and from 0 to 10, 10 being the worst, what number would you say you're at now?
Like 1, 2,
Good. And compared to what was it when we first started?
4.
Good, so we've moved it down. What's good about it is, it just doesn't have to be for the library situation, it can be for any of life's inevitable adversities. And in my view, what you're really doing is flexing the rational self-helping muscle. You're retraining your thinking, so you always have a choice as to how you choose to react. And to me, it's a bit like martial arts for the mind. You're actively looking for the problem, so that in itself will reduce anticipation. Then when you've got the problem, you're letting it sweep all over you. It's a bit like a bully that keeps hassling you. Your reaction to it makes it worse. Let it sweep all over you. Then as it goes past, you're kind of giving it a kick with unconditional self-acceptance. So that's rational emotive imagery. Was that okay?
That was fantastic.
Really?
Because when you go into the library, it was just, I mean, you know, I would always find the excuses not to go into the library because I'm aware I should have read everything in the entire library and be there all the time or whatever. And when you said experience it, I thought, oh, butterflies. Yeah. I know the butterflies. It's like, oh my God, I've got this to do. I've got to pick that book up. I've got to drop that book off.
Yeah.
I should have read this. I should have read that. I should have read the other. And so the butterflies were familiar, and then it like shifted my shoulders, and then I got a really dry mouth. And I don't normally experience that, but I got this really dry mouth. And then I realised that when you go into the library, there's the entrance, and there's the library cafe. And I actually spent a lot of time in the library building, but I never get past the cafe there. I sort of go in. I think, you know what, I'm really thirsty. I'm just going to get, you know, an orange juice or something before I go into the library. And I just thought, God, you know, it was really...
Good, that was memory. So it's most vulnerable to change at the time that we most dislike it.
So I'm always just like, oh, just get a lilt or something.
Before
I'm going to go into the library. I'm just feeling a bit... So I'll get a drink first.
Good for you.
It's quite, yes.
Just as an add-on
Explains an awful lot.
Good. Just as an add-on to that, what I would maybe say, just as a word of warning, so to speak, that if you do try that in hypnotherapy, I tend to use the NLP cinema screen in the distance to disassociate the person from any feelings, because the feelings might be a bit too intense. So if they can maybe even imagine themselves on the screen initially, and for 1 minute just observe it, then gradually let it dissipate. But I do consciously encourage them to practice that, you know, on a conscious level. But with hypnotherapy, I use a cinema screen to disassociate themselves from the feeling. Then maybe step into the screen and give themselves unconditional acceptance. If for no other reason, we're all fallible, mistake-making human beings, and probably always will be. You just sit there, Alan, because I'm kind of winding up now anyway. I just want, if I can, I think there's a couple more aspects. One is the self-esteem issue, which is, I know is a much vaunted term, and there is some truth, there is something in it, so I'm not discounting self-esteem, but again I'm going to quote this guy Ellis when he said that self-esteem is the greatest sickness known to man or womankind because it's conditional. I certainly noticed in a lot of the examples, a lot of my case histories, that the client tends to self-rate or measure themselves against what they think other people think. Now, again, if memory serves me right, Ellis on his 90th birthday was asked by a reporter from the New York Times what he considered to be the biggest problem that afflicted human beings. He replied to the reporter's astonishment. He said, self-esteem is the greatest psychological sickness known to mankind, as it's dependent, and I'm quoting him, there's bad language coming up, so don't blame me. It's dependent on what we should say, should do, should come across, should wear. He said, shouldhood equals shithood. So therefore, self-esteem is no more than perfume for shithood. In other words, we're living up to a false sense of self to keep other people happy. And as he made this statement, Nicole Kidman apparently was at the party. She came in and smiled at him in a phony manner and said, Al, you look great. And he looked back at her and said, you look okay. And the reporter said to him, how can you speak to her like that? And he said, look, this Hollywood actress comes in here and says I look great. I buy into it. I'm great. She comes in tomorrow and says I look bad. I buy into that. I'm bad. Back to shithood for me, eh? See? So unconditional self-acceptance, you kind of go into situations knowing you're protected because you give yourself the vote of confidence. You know that you're fallible in mistake-making. So we reduce the need to try to prove otherwise. I just want to close, if I can, and to go through this vicious circle of psychological misery. And this is something I did about 12 years ago. And I'm going to plug this because it's on a book that I sell on my website called Breaking the Vicious Circle of Psychological Misery. And where I found it quite useful is certainly for a client who's pretty severely nervously ill, it kind of lets them know that someone knows the situation that they're in. If you look at the top left, you'll see memory, which of course, according to Claire Weeks, was the one thing that was likely to keep a person stuck, even years after, thanks Alan, even years after the original event. So memory's coming back with a bad feeling, which provokes a perception, usually of awfulness or extreme fear. The person then tends to take almost a compensatory demand, should not, ought not, must not happen, which then sends another danger signal back down to the nervous system, heart rate quickens, glands above the kidneys secrete more adrenaline into the system than is usual. Then when they experience the symptom, they tend to, oh my goodness, or what if the symptom, which sends another danger signal back down to the nervous system, more adrenaline. Over time, what they tend to do is become bewildered as to the state that they're in, because it's so unlike their old self. Invariably, they may anxiously introspect. So it's done with quite a lot of fear and bewilderment. Over time, due to the intensity of the anxiety and the worry, there's fatigue. There's 4 fatigues: muscular, emotional, mental, and a fatigue of the spirit. These 4 fatigues are pretty nasty and can lead a person into thinking that they're really losing it. They're very fearful that they're going insane. This obviously will then lead to depletion. The body will become very tired, exhausted mentally as well. And of course, at this point, depression can be an early visitor. The cognitive triad that Aaron Beck came up with was no hope for self, the world, or the future. Obviously, self-confidence will then be even more greatly affected. Then, of course, this then leads to sensitization. That is the state in which our nervous system is transmitting electrical impulses too acutely through reverberated circuitry. Claire Weeks used to say it's really no more than a superficial electrical discharge. You must not let your life be ruined by a superficial electrical discharge. Pretty easy to say, but this then, of course, then feeds memory, and then memory brings it all back, and here we go around the vicious circle. So in my view, the real culprit is the bewilderment, obviously, the demand and the what if. So if I can maybe at least give a person peace of mind, that can go some way into helping them. And it's also, I think, in my view, it's a good roadmap for the therapist, so they can see where they're at with the person. I think we've probably got about 5 minutes left. If anybody would like to ask any quick questions, I'd certainly, or even afterwards if you want to speak to me, I'll certainly try to do so. So I'm going to try and shut up, and if anybody's got a question, feel free to ask. Great, well, thank you very much. If you want to ask anything afterwards, I'll be around for half an hour or so anyway. So, thank you, Sean, much appreciated.
I'll go something for you as well.
Well, thank you very much.